Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Historically Defensible Claim with Mr. Green. This one's called Flunking the Response. If you like what you see in here, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and please share the video. Thanks. On a moonlit night in July 64 CE, a long-simmering potential problem exploded. High winds helped fuel massive fire in Rome, a city of 1 million, and the center of a global power rarely paralleled in human history. The main account of the fire comes from aristocratic Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus tells his readers the fire began in the shops around the Circus Maximus, where they did the chariot racing, and then spread throughout Rome, burning up many of the city's districts, including ancient temples and even the imperial palace itself. Ancient Rome had fires all the time, but not like this one. It burned for 6 days and then flared back up again in the following week, causing even more destruction and death. Thousands were left dead or homeless. This was a predictable problem, and many were already concerned about fire prevention in Rome. Despite the Romans' reputation for amazing urban planning, the main hub of their empire was a rat's maze that grew up haphazardly over time of crowded streets, tenement housing, alleyways. You get the idea. Malaria and other diseases were actually pretty common in Rome, especially in the summer months, which is why the emperor at the time, Nero, wasn't in the city when the fire happened. He was supposedly in the city of Antium, not too far away, on a vacay with a more salubrious climate. But why did this particular fire get burned into our collective memory? It had more to do with the rumors about it and the government response to it than the event itself. The rumor, dutifully reported by Tacitus, is that Nero started the fire on purpose to make way for more Greek-style Rome, with a new palace for himself. And then Nero supposedly sang a song above the burning city while the flames ruined the lives of countless Romans. Nero supposedly planned to rename this part of Rome, or maybe even the whole city itself, Neropolis. Nero was a big lover of Greek language and culture and wanted to Greekify Rome more fully. The rumor circulated that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, an expression that's entered the English language for callous and inept government response to some kind of natural disaster, crisis, or tragedy. This cliche has some problems, though. First of all, Nero didn't play the fiddle, he played the lyre. And he wasn't even in Rome when the fire broke out. Probably. The big issue with Nero wasn't that he flunked the response to the fire. It was that his existing personality flaws were magnified by this disaster. You get where this is headed? The COVID-19 outbreak was perhaps predictable, but it's always really easy to say that in hindsight. The federal response to the pandemic has been, let's be kind and call it uneven. The issue for Donald Trump is that existing aspects of his personality and leadership that many Americans, even among his supporters, consider regrettable but largely harmless, are now potentially catastrophic liabilities in how he approaches this particular national calamity. Disclaimer time. I have 3 pretty big caveats for this historically defensible claim. The first one, Roman history is really, really, really long. It is extremely easy to cherry pick for examples, superficially similar to some current day political issue. Am I doing that? Yes, but I'm trying to keep it really narrow in my defense, focused on one particular event. Second, I realize that comparing any 21st century political leader in a modern liberal democracy with a boy emperor that took power through heredity and all these elaborate court machinations is historically dicey. The institutions that govern the USA and the Roman Empire are completely different. Rome's administration was pretty minimal for all the empire's pretensions to totalitarian control, with a pretty small bureaucracy in Nero's day, even by the standards of the later empire. Forget about comparing it to the complexity and reach of a modern nation state. Finally, Nero murdered his political opponents with pretty reckless abandon as his reign progressed. Trump's Twitter attacks on Lion Ted don't quite meet Nero's standard for brutality, so I wanted to make sure that my claim of a parallel between these leaders is focused on one particular aspect of their leadership. The two main sources on Nero from the ancient world are Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars and Tacitus's Annals. Both of these guys don't like Nero, to put it mildly, and a lot of times they come right out and say it frequently. Here's a line from the first paragraph of Suetonius on Nero. It seems to me worthwhile to give an account of several members of this family, meaning Nero's family, to show more clearly that though Nero degenerated from the good qualities of his ancestors, he yet reproduced the vices of each of them as if transmitted to him by natural inheritance. So these sources are not too fond of Nero, but they're what we've got. So, let's go with it. Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and he came to power at the ripe old age of 16 in 54 CE. He had basically no qualifications other than being Augustus's great-great-grandson. Ancestry was a big deal in Roman politics, especially in the first century. He really rose to power through the Cersei Lannister-type maneuverings of his mother, Agrippina, and the first few years of Nero's reign went okay. He was somewhat of a puppet while the literal adults in the room, his mother Agrippina, whom he later had killed, and the philosopher and statesman Seneca, whom he later had murdered, called most of the plays for Nero's power, which was supposed to be the model of mercy and rationality. Now, as Nero grew older and became more comfortable in control, he removed a lot of these guardrails and started indulging in his inner showman, throwing games and entertainments that ingratiated himself with the Roman people. These entertainments were often accompanied by free grain or other kind of gifts distributed to the public. He started to stock his administration with sycophants and pushed out a lot more of his credible advisors. As Nero's reign became more and more cringeworthy, key elites and the common people started to turn on him, and Nero increasingly lost touch with reality about what was really going on in his empire and how he was perceived. See, he thought he was giving the people this. But in reality, they were getting this. And the cringe is a key factor with Nero. He fancied himself a talented singer, poet, musician, and indulged this interest more and more as his reign progressed. Now, historians disagree on how good he was as a poet and performer. He performed his poems and music privately at first, and then more publicly on stage in the Circus Maximus or the arena. And into the midst of all this came the fire. I'm a fire starter, twisted fire starter. Now, it's pretty easy to do a superficial analysis of Trump's similarities to Nero. So is Trump's response to COVID-19 akin to Nero's response to the Great Fire of 64 CE? Well, when the fire happened, Nero returned to Rome quickly and was supposedly pretty energetic in his relief efforts, providing food and housing to those displaced and even opening up his own palace grounds as a refuge. Coronavirus has been raging for months, with no signs of it abating as it spread to new parts of the country. Trump's efforts to combat the coronavirus have been uneven at best. Now, there have been some extenuating circumstances, notably the hot mess of CDC testing procedures at the start of all this. But the federal government has been pretty hands-off. You can absolutely debate the quality and the need of the federal response, and it has its defenders. This claim is more to do about how Nero's response to the fire and Trump's response to the pandemic magnified an existing problem with their leadership and public personas. So let's get into that a little bit. Nero used the fire to renovate Rome with a more rational grid and basic fire prevention measures in both urban design and city organization. Even Tacitus, who hates Nero, has to grant these improvements were a good thing. So far, so good. But Nero also ordered the construction of an enormous palace, literally called the Golden House, with private lakes, lavish art and decorations, and a 100-foot-high statue of himself as the Colossus. This palace, it was never finished, would have been about a third of Rome's total acreage. It's Nero's intense vanity that gave rise to the apocryphal story that he fiddled while Rome burned. Romans weren't immune to fake news or memes. So as the Golden House started to rise and was built in the months following the fire, the rumor of Nero's conspiratorial fire starter grew in popularity and undermined his former reputation as a man of the people and his popularity with the poorer citizens of Rome. I think it's impossible to deny that Donald Trump is a pretty vain man, often prone to hyperbole, exaggerations, and he has a pretty complicated relationship with the truth. He cares a great deal about his personal reputation and his brand. And these attributes have come to the fore at several points throughout the pandemic response. Just look at the infamous decision to place his name on the stimulus checks approved by Congress and paid for by us American taxpayers. Nero used to do this as well, emptying Roman coffers to help common people, to be sure, but always for his own aggrandizement and reputation. Well, this nonsense with the signatures on the checks actually held up some of the payments, but that didn't matter to Trump as long as he could be flattered and glorified. The claims about miracle drugs and vaccines and the downplaying of the virus also confirmed the existing character traits of hyperbole and exaggeration. Sadly, more than 1% of COVID cases leave a lasting impact. It's killed over 130,000 Americans. Trump's exaggerations about his inauguration crowd size, while perhaps silly, didn't affect most people's daily lives. Misinformation about the disease does. The response to COVID seems self-serving in other ways, too. Check out the recent trips by Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar. Florida, Georgia, Michigan, Maine, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Boston. New Hampshire's included in its media market. These aren't necessarily the places where the virus outbreaks have been the worst, but they're all battleground states to be sure. The virus response and where federal attention seems to go seems pretty tied to the upcoming election. And it's not helped by Azar's obvious politicking while he's on these trips, singing the praises of Trump's response to the outbreak that now seems to be rapidly spinning out of control. Finally, the president, ever the lover of spectacle, continues to host grandiose rallies, including a fiery speech from Mount Rushmore, complete with a backdrop of fireworks in the midst of a pandemic. From where I sit, Trump is, at heart, a showman. Sort of a political P.T. Barnum. Normally, this brand works for him, and was a huge contributor to his electoral success in 2016. But during the pandemic, it seems hubristic and highly risky to hold these kind of mass gatherings to flatter Trump's ego. The reason the fiddling rumor stuck was because of Nero's belief that he was the world's most talented performer. He was putting the bulk of his time into this nonsense and seemed to be neglecting the basic functions of his office as emperor. An office that was only a few generations old by the time Nero took power. There weren't a lot of precedents about how emperors should behave, so we can give him a pass on that one, I suppose. One thing people could agree on was that Nero wasn't very presidential in his behavior, if you know what I mean. He was obsessed with flattery and winning awards. For the early part of Nero's reign, most Romans, even elite ones, were willing to put up with all the stupid shit he did. Singing, chariot racing, giving himself artistic awards for how great a musician he was. It didn't really matter because the empire was basically humming along. But when it hit the fan, Nero's vanity and approach to the imperial office now became a big problem. His character flaws were amplified in his self-aggrandizing response to the fire of 64 CE. He blamed the fire on easy-to-scapegoat minorities like the Christians, but so brutalized them, he actually created sympathy for the group of people that he wanted the Romans to despise. And so it is for Trump. His golfing, tweeting, and lying were perhaps unseemly or unfortunate, but largely harmless to most Americans, if you like some of his policies, or overall nationalist message. Not all Americans, to be sure. They were harmless, though, until they started to seem to distract or even exacerbate the pandemic. His bizarre attitudes towards science were perhaps forgivable, I guess, till he says stuff like this.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that has him in check, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do, either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that, too. Sounds interesting.
Get the right folks who could.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? 'Cause again, I say maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm not a doctor.
Lines like Kung Flu seem counterproductive, to say the least, and don't really help anyone avoid the virus or deal with its effects. The fallout from the fire crippled Nero's reputation, as he was busy singing and dancing his way across Greece, winning 1,808 awards for his musical and vocal talents. His character flaws were no longer regrettable but largely innocuous. Instead, they seemed to become existential threats to the Roman state and its survival. The Democrats have realized this, and in recent ads, connecting the more dubious aspects of Trump's personality to his response to the pandemic. His penchant for conspiracy theories now seems to cost Americans their lives from coronavirus. Mistrusted the deep state, once thought to be him draining the swamp, but now more voters aren't so sure. Because it seems like medical experts are what we need in a public health crisis. Trump's antics don't seem harmless anymore to a lot of voters, many of whom are now doubting his competence. This shows in wide cross-sections of polls, especially among so-called swing voters. And by the way, I'd love to meet one of these people. If you're out there, please hit me up in the comments. And his China bashing and the blame game favored Trump activities doesn't alter the fact that tens of thousands of Americans have died on his watch. The Great Fire of Rome most likely was not Nero's fault, but it played into existing doubts about his leadership among many in Rome. Donald Trump didn't start coronavirus, and neither did 5G or China either. Nobody did. These things happen like fires. But the response highlights the things about Trump's personality that many Americans already found off-putting. That could be as fatal for Trump's presidency as the fire was for Nero's principate. As his enemies closed in around him, Nero was said by Suetonius to have repeatedly muttered, "What an artist the world is losing." I wonder if Trump's final statements as president will be about the size of his crowds and his television ratings. Hi, thank you all for sticking it out to the end and watching. I really appreciate it. Please, again, don't forget to like and subscribe, and all my sources are listed in the description below. Thanks again.